Rayman Legends is a very good game. It must be. At time of writing, it is the highest ranked Rayman game on Metacritic. It's also the best-selling member of the series, at least of the mainline entries. So something is striking a chord. But what is it? Why this one and not the others? Story and mood, maybe? Nah, Rayman 2 is the place to go for that. Instinct and flow? It's good, but Rayman Origins is better. It's arguable whether or not Legends even has combat, but even if you say so, you can't claim it's anywhere near the same league as Rayman 3. And nothing compares to Rayman 1 for raw challenge. By the way, if you want to know more about any of those games, I've got plenty of other videos you can check out by now. Have a gander at them. So what is this last one for, then? What emotion or mood is the game best suited to satisfy? What experience does it offer? Well, that might be the wrong way to think about Legends, so let's see if we can find another perspective. First, though, it's worth talking about the game's development, for I believe Rayman Legends brought us the only time our hero has found himself in controversy. The game was first revealed publicly via a survey, presumably to gauge interest, and was later announced officially as a Wii U exclusive. The idea was that in addition to the 4 standard player characters we had from Origins co-op play, there would now be a 5th player that would use the touchscreen to control a different, unique character. Generally speaking, I'm not a fan of exclusives, but when there's a hardware reason like this, it makes enough sense to be justified. A Gamescom trailer gave us a release date in late 2012, but it was eventually delayed to February of 2013, with a demo released in the interim to keep the flames of hype burning. So far, nothing special, but then it was delayed again, and this time, the news came with backlash. Why? Because the game was finished. They could have released it on time in a completed state with little drama, but Ubisoft decided otherwise. It would no longer be an exclusive, you see, and the company decreed that the game would come to all platforms at once. Thus, the finished Wii U version was not seen for months. Now, I think situations like, for instance, the backlash when Horizon Zero Dawn came to PC are, well, very silly. I think it's a good thing when more people get to play a game. Indeed, I'm playing Legends on PC, and I don't have, nor do I intend to pick up, a Wii U, so getting rid of the exclusivity was to my benefit personally. But that doesn't mean the delay was required or appropriate. There was a finished game. Releasing it would have given the Wii U players what they were expecting, and the other players would lose nothing. It'd still be in their hands at the same time either way. This stings double for those who had specifically purchased a Wii U for Rayman Legends. And it wasn't only the fans who were pissed off. Having just crunched for more than a year to meet their deadline, the developers were not happy to hear that that time frame had just been rendered irrelevant by the same company who had originally set it for them. Near as I can tell, the only reason for this choice was a lack of confidence in the Wii U's ability to sell copies. That's a fine reason to drop the exclusivity of the game in the long run, but again, not a good reason to forsake the release date entirely. Unless it's not players coming together over a good product that drives you, but the image of cash in your hand. Under that framework, you don't want to waste the hype of release on a failing console. Fans and developers be damned. I suppose that's capitalism for you, but that does little to blunt the impact on the people affected, and I don't think our shitty economic system lets Ubisoft off the hook for their side of the events. At least a small concession was made by releasing the online mode early for the Wii U. This wasn't enough in my eyes, but we take what we can get in the end. 1 step forward and 2 steps back, it seems. The whole thing was a disappointing episode in a series which has largely been guided by artistic value over monetary gain. I mean, you know you've fucked up when people actually protest the decision, and even Michel Ancel, Rayman's creator, grabs a photo with them. At least we can say this is all in the past now, and thankfully the product we got was worth the wait. To flip the script a little, I'm going to highlight some of the good stuff the development process gave us, specifically the expanded capabilities of the engine. This included support for 3D models and a dynamic lighting system covered in a pre-release interview by The Next Level. These were mostly used for aesthetic purposes, but that is no reason to shun them. Visuals have always been of utmost importance to the Rayman IP. There are some ways that the tools were put to gameplay as well, but more on that later. First, let's do this one last time. What defines a Rayman game? 3 little metrics come to my mind: excellent visuals, excellent music, and excellent polish. I've also emphasized in past videos that the series has favored these qualities over innovation, with the slight exception of Rayman 3. Rayman Legends stays true to them as well, but there is one way it tried to be a little more outside the box. So, let's start the analytical part of this video by talking about that. Murphy. The little fucker is back, but he can't talk anymore, so forgivable. Murphy is that unique character I mentioned before. Controlling him was originally going to be done by a 5th player using the Wii U touchscreen. It would work by tapping or sliding the screen on key objects to activate contextual effects. Lacking such a device, my version will have him automatically move into position, and all that is needed from me is a button press to trigger the action, or sometimes a couple of buttons to tip an object one way or the other. Using this, Murphy can be put to moving platforms, cutting ropes, eating cake. No, really, cake must be eaten. On the surface, this is pretty dull. It seems very close to QuickTime events. Pressing the button is not doing something cool, it's giving the game permission to do something cool for you. But Rayman Legends is wise with its design, and it finds a way to put an interesting spin on the system. To understand this, I must first draw attention to something else: the Teensies. Like all Rayman games, there are beings in each level locked in cages that must be rescued. In this game, they are the Teensies, like in Rayman 2 and 3. Furthermore, again like some other Rayman games, you need to free a certain number of them to advance to new levels. Where Rayman Legends distinguishes itself from the other 4 is the sheer volume of prisoners. Most levels manage to fit 10 of the little buggers within their twisting environments, noting that said levels are normally just 5 to 10 minutes long. Combine that with the hefty lum reward granted every time someone is freed, and you'll soon associate that lovely dopamine hit you keep getting with the Teensies being liberated. This is true from the very first level, where it takes less than a minute to run into your first prisoner, which then triggers a trail of lums that leads you right to the second. If that's not enough, there are bonus rooms where you can go to rescue a king or queen Teensie. These are also in most levels, and the earliest of them can be found right after the couple of non-royals you encounter at the start. You're literally just a few minutes into the game, and already you're drenched in positive feedback for one simple action: free the Teensies. It's only a few steps further along that Murphy joins you and you get your first taste of the new mechanics. Using him through this section is a lot like that brain-dead button slamming that you're probably expecting based on my earlier description. Merely press the Murphy button when he moves to an object and you'll end up with a desirable outcome. Hammering the button like this will both progress the level and free ever more Teensies. It seems so easy and requires just about no engagement from the player, not with the new systems anyway. Then, this happens. And you've gone and trapped the Teensie. Still where you can see them, but forever out of your reach. How could I have been so reckless, you say to yourself. Or maybe, oh shit, that wasn't right. Either way, from this point on, you'll think twice about carelessly pressing that button. Consideration must be put to where Murphy is to be used and where you should hold back. The rest of the level is designed to lock this idea in. It switches to puzzles that aren't quite as high-speed and obvious as what you've completed so far. They're still easy, but not entirely witless. Just enough to make sure you've got an eye on what you're doing before doing it. Thus, the way you should approach Murphy's mechanics is carved into stone. Think, then act. Future Murphy sections throughout the game uphold this code with just a few exceptions. They slow the game down and get you to take in the full picture before charging into the various gauntlets ahead. Being too eager to use Murphy continues to cost you. Sometimes Teensies, sometimes lums, and sometimes it will doom you to a reload. Always, this is done with great thought and depth. Clear pride is on display in the build of these challenges. Murphy is not present for the whole adventure, but there is a remarkable overlap between the levels with him and the best ones in the game. They're fun and thoughtful, an all-round great experience. For those using an appropriate console, the touchscreen controls for Murphy are still functional, though I do feel like this is more of a gimmick now. I find it hard to see how using them would be more practical than the straightforward process of pressing a button. Still, it's good that the option exists where it can. The point stands that Rayman Legends manages to be a little innovative, and importantly, what it does is good. It doesn't sacrifice the polish and attention to detail that characterize the prior games of the series. It's an impressive feat, but perhaps more interesting is how different the Murphy sections are philosophically from a normal level in Rayman Origins. At first glance, this second modern-ish Rayman game seems more like an expansion on the previous rather than a new game in its own right, and at least on some level I think this is a valid statement to make. For instance, there are obvious similarities visually. Several sprites and animations are blatantly reused. Controls are a similar story. The use of momentum, snappy jumps, and attacks in motion that encourage a committed, instinctive playstyle is still intact. The most notable difference in this regard is that your current speed will be preserved if you attack while in the air, which seems perfectly in line with the fluid feeling of playing Origins. And even in the level design, a lot of the time you'll find situations that want you to bolt in full speed and simply react to what you encounter along the way. In fact, about half the game's levels are directly taken from Origins. Slightly reimagined, but there's no pretense that they are anything new. Yet, these Murphy sections feel like they are specifically designed to pull you out of the mindset Origins was always encouraging, to stop you from tackling the game through intuition and start using a bit of reasoning. And while Murphy is the most consistent and most obvious example of this, it applies to much of the rest of the game as well. Where it can be felt more than anywhere else is in the game's handling of lums. I pointed out in the last video how Origins is riddled with mini time limits that, if fulfilled, reward you with additional lums to your stock. There were 3 main systems for this: lums trapped in bubbles, enemies bubbleizing, and king lums. These were used to teach you of and consistently reinforce the game's desired playstyle. So the fact that Legends almost completely cuts these features is a clear statement that it does not want you to play the same way. Only the bubble lums are still present, and even then only in the remade Origins levels. The new missions are void of all 3. Instead, we have trails of lums, where one of them is purple. Gathering that specific lum will cause the next in line to turn purple as well. That will do the same for the next, and so on until you reach the end. So long as you gather them in this order, each of them will be worth 2. But collect even 1 before its turn, and the chain will revert to normal, barring you from the bonus. While this system may be used as an incentive for speed by getting you to chase after a trail that is moving away, it's not fundamentally a speedy system like the ones it replaced. It can be, and is, also used to encourage a slower approach, as they're easier to grab in the right order if you take the time to learn the path they are following first. And of course, the biggest lum payouts still come from the coins, and now the Teensies, both of which push you towards that less hasty style. These coins were the main aberration from the speed-based play in the last game, but now they are not so lonely on that throne. Still, I should say there are some systems kept which remain in line with Origins' playstyle, and some are even modified to be an even better fit for them. For example, the ranged fist attacks. In Origins, these would be lost if you took any sort of damage, so you needed to be a little careful and probably a little slower whenever you had it. Now you get to keep the attack no matter what. With that said, I think the change was motivated more for allowing greater diversity in level design and less for encouraging swiftness. If you took damage and lost the fist in a situation like this, you're simply stuck, and that's obviously not ideal. Origins could use the ranged attacks as a bonus, but for this reason, it could not build whole levels with them in mind. Legends can. Not always flowy levels either, so it's still holding true to this difference. On another argument, one may notice that enemy design is still very similar. The AI tends to be very predictable, and they always die in just 1 hit. Not something you stop and think about, something you flow through, like in Origins. To counter this point, I'll say that sometimes you can't just rush around their attacks and hit them anymore. They often come with defenses that need to be countered via timing or environmental awareness. In fairness, the best example of an enemy designed like this might be these little robots from Origins, not Legends. But the level design in that game will either position them so that they can be easily dealt with, or so they can be avoided altogether, thus they don't interfere with the overall flow of play, not unless you let them. Conversely, you absolutely will be roadblocked by such enemies in Legends. Finally, let's point out that you still can only take a max of 2 hits before dying, and there are frequent checkpoints in case you do happen to take both of them. Once again, design choices that favor the Origins style. For this, I got nothing. This simply makes Legends more like its predecessor without much of a caveat. I do wonder sometimes if it would have been better to have a different health system for the newer game, but overall, it's fine as is. I saved this point for last to illustrate that while Legends is not as committed to the musical gameplay idea as Origins, it hasn't completely forgotten it either. With all those mechanical similarities and differences covered, there's one more thing to say that highlights my point. This time in the layout of level selection itself, specifically concerning time trials. In this game, they take the form of invasions, where enemies from different worlds will populate an existing level, effectively making it a new level altogether. This gives the player a speed test if they want it, but not in a way that's going to affect how they see or play the level it's based on. The two are completely different challenges that don't bleed into each other in any noticeable way, if at all. The game is very clear that the invasions are for speedy shenanigans, but don't expect to take that back to the normal levels. So, hopefully you get the idea by this point. Legends takes the core mechanics and ideas of Origins and rebuilds them into something new. Something that's more versatile and not so focused on a single vision. It still asks you to enter a mindset of flow and speed sometimes, but only for a visit. It doesn't want you to settle in for the whole game. Impressively, when it does ask you to go there for a level, it deserves the exact same stamp of quality that you would give to the last game. Legends doesn't do more at the expense of what Origins did well, it simply does more. Well, almost. There's one way that it couldn't keep up. Difficulty. Not that there aren't tricky levels, but it can't touch the heights that Origins reached with its take on the land of the living dead. That was a phenomenal level, glorious in its high pace and engagement with all of the game's mechanics, except swimming, I suppose. It was also hard, so hard that it was virtually impossible to beat without several deaths. It had license to do this because of the game's commitment to the one idea. The fact that almost every single level and subsystem had speed and timing at their core meant that you knew, almost instinctively, that the final challenge would be the same thing pushed to the extreme. And it worked. We have a stupidly hard level, but it feels appropriate within the game's context. Rayman Legends, with its lack of the same strong focus, simply can't do this. It can set difficult tasks, but they always must fall within the realm of tough, but fair. Then again, perhaps that's for the best, given that this bullshit seems to be Legends' idea of an ultimate challenge. How do we make the game harder? Oh, just make it that they can't fucking see what they're doing. Genius. They're not even new levels, they just reused some and put shitty filters over them. But whatever, that's a small complaint really. Let's use them to move on to something positive again. These missions weren't chosen at random, rather the opposite. They are the climaxes of each world, and what cool climaxes they are. So if the game can't use difficulty to emphasize its zenith moments, then it needs an alternative, and it finds one in an unusual way. Musical levels. These are fantastic. They are the peak, not just of this game's musical trajectory, but that of the entire series. Rayman 1 simply had good music, Rayman 2 and 3 used tracks that updated in accordance to your progress, and Rayman Origins directly associates music and action, making the act of playing itself take on a rhythmic feeling. Rayman Legends is where all these strengths come together at once. Your actions are again rhythmic, timed such that they match the beat and key moments in the song as it plays alongside the level. Or maybe we should say the level plays alongside the song, because the two things just aren't easily separable in the moment. They step together in perfect collaboration to create a joy that can only be described as awesome. The cherry on top is the simple fact that the songs are really fucking good. Some are based on existing music, such as the one capping off the first world, which is a remix of Ram Jam's version of Black Betty. Others are original compositions for the game, like the orchestral piece presented by the second world's finale, which was cleverly set up by the background music of that world's third level to give a little more sense of continuity. Personally, what I think really stands out most is how these missions reintroduce melody to the music without losing the relation to gameplay that such melodies were originally sacrificed for. The 3D Raymans, and to a lesser extent Origins, favored music without predefined build-ups or emotional high and low points, allowing them to move through their phases in time with the player's progress through the area. That's great, but in comparing them to the soundtrack of Rayman 1, you see the price of this structure. The music in that game is kind of just better than the others. Not necessarily as an enhancement to your play experience, but simply as music. It has much more sense of direction and intention than most of the pieces from the other Rayman games, though not quite all of them. Really though, this shouldn't be a surprise. Timing is a vital part of music, and when control of such an ingredient is given to something other than the piece itself, some of the raw beauty and power must also be surrendered. I can understand why this was done, and you absolutely can argue that it was for the best. I might even agree, but it remains true that they fell behind the original musical standard as a result. But the musical levels in Legends are specifically built for a certain song. The whole point is that the soundtrack drives your actions, and in such a context, this dichotomy doesn't exist. The music develops to brilliant peaks and valleys all on its own, just like in Rayman 1, and the gameplay marches alongside it every step of the way, like in the rest of the series. Now, of course, there are specific principles to how these levels are designed, which mean you can't do this for every level in the game. Not without making the whole thing a linear time race anyway. But resolving the contradiction between the two previous styles, even for these few levels, while still being such great fun, is an impressive feat in and of itself. I feel happy saying that this must be one of the greatest musical milestones in platformer history, and certainly the greatest in the series. In fact, I can't really think of a good example from the genre that rivals it. It's not the biggest part of the game in terms of time spent, but the value you get out of the time you do is utterly unmatched. However, from a broader point of view, do they make for good climaxes to each world? Do they represent the game doing what it does the best? Yes, I think they do, but let's dig a bit further in before I explain that. What cannot be called even half as memorable is the story, the very part you might expect to stick in your head the most. I guess it functions, but there's just not much to say for it. The basic setup is that Rayman and friends have been asleep for 100 years. In that time, the villainous magician has somehow cloned himself to make 5 magicians, and each of them has taken over one of the worlds. You need to head into each for a few eventless levels, then rescue a Teensie that the land's oppressor has taken as a personal hostage, defeat some monster he sets on you in a chase or fight, then slap each of the tinkering tyrants into a distant asteroid. Yeah, just go with it. Once there, they will be tormented by little devil aliens, seemingly forever. Each of them make a regular noise while being tormented that slowly builds up over the game into music that plays for the credits. Oh yes, even for the very, very final screen, action and rhythm are still tied together. Also, sometimes one of them turns you into a duck, which is amazing. But other than that, every world literally follows these exact same beats and uses the same cutscenes for all of them as well. It's not exactly trying to hide the repetition. There's nothing interesting here by my reckoning. No themes, no twists, no structural ideas that are worth dedicating any more time of this video to. However, maybe that's a good thing through certain eyes. These little events I just outlined are simple and self-contained. They don't need to be considered in any broader story to make sense. Even if you have total amnesia, you'll still know everything you need to just from playing the mission. This means there's little importance put on the overall plot, but I get the appeal. You see, I used to play story-driven RPGs a lot before I entered the adult workforce, and I still love to when I can find the time and energy, but it's harder. It's just harder these days because my mental resources have to go into the job, and keeping track of a long, intertwined story is the last thing I want to do when I'm exhausted with spare time in the evening. And that's it, really. Rayman Legends feels meticulously constructed for when I'm exhausted with spare time. It feels like it's trying to fit in with exactly this sort of daily schedule. It does not need you to set aside several hours every night, nor does it put too much pressure on you mentally. This sounds like something a lot of games could do, and yes, they can to an extent, but Legends is so well optimized for it. There's no high-stakes story, there's no super difficult or complicated gameplay, there's no preference for a specific mindset. There's not even a reward structure that favors long stints in the game. In fact, there's quite the opposite. It rewards short but frequent check-ins. The most blatant example would be the creatures, which give you an additional lum reward daily. You only need to hop on for a minute to receive this bonus, but for maximum efficiency, that is a minute every 24 hours. Another is found in the UI. When in the hub area, your total lum count is displayed at the top left of the screen. It's basically your score, and sometimes getting enough will yield a reward, usually by unlocking new characters. Now, to be clear, there are other metrics for achievement built into the game too, like the Teensies, but the lums are the only reward that has no endpoint, and in turn, the only one that acknowledges the entirety of the effort you put to it. What stands out is that this isn't the sum of high scores from each level, it's simply all the lums you've collected, period. Even if all you're doing is replaying one mission a million times, each individual playthrough adds to the count. Therefore, the game doesn't demand that you constantly keep up your skill or become paranoid about perfection. It simply asks you to play the game in whatever way suits you. The lums don't serve to measure speed or precision or even skill, really, just engagement, however that may manifest. The only thing the game doesn't want you to do is stop logging on. The reason for this might be another new feature the game offers, the online mode, and woe and behold, it manages to exist without microtransactions. Hallelujah. The idea was that the game would update with daily and weekly challenges, so whenever you logged on, there would be something new to try out, in theory anyway. Nothing too long, but enough to be worth a wee glance in the evening at least. But from what I was able to play, this sounds a lot better than it actually is. It works by taking some existing levels, breaking them down into different components, and then randomly placing those components together on an infinite path. It's then a matter of collecting as many lums as you can, or getting as far as you can without dying. I think it's an okay gimmick, but for it to reach its potential, there need to be people building challenges dedicated to the feature from scratch. Unfortunately, this is easy to say, yet hard to execute. All the same, I believe it is necessary for the online mode to sustain a large long-term player base. With that said, maybe they were more unique and interesting once upon a time. You see, I couldn't actually play the live elements as intended because the servers are no longer functioning. The PC servers were shut down in the September of 2020, though it seems they may have been out unofficially for about a year by then, and the console servers would later come to the same fate in 2022. Exactly why is not known, but given that in-game there is no way to get money out of your wallet, I imagine that Ubisoft would only want to maintain the servers if the game's sales or publicity were still making a mark on their graphs. So, was it? As mentioned earlier, it is the best-selling game in the series, which obviously means it sold better than Rayman 1, the game that Ubisoft itself describes as their first big hit. Therefore, Legends must have been a hit as well, right? Sort of, but it didn't exist in the same context as the 1995 game. The world had moved on. Comparing it instead to several of its contemporaries published by Ubisoft, the sales of Rayman Legends just weren't that impressive. With this in mind, we see a clear reason why they would eventually opt out of maintaining it. It was slightly after these shutdowns that I started getting into Rayman again after basically leaving the series behind when I went through my teenage years, and with this rediscovery came my very first playthrough of Rayman Legends. As such, to me, the online features have always been inaccessible. To play the challenges that I did, I used Rayman Legends Challenge Manager, an open source software most recently updated by one Loris Witzchard. It allows you to customize your own challenge experience. Admittedly, I didn't explore all that could be done with it because I didn't know how to add new challenges to select from, but I did have access to something called the Training Room, which provides offline versions of the challenges to tackle. It's a fantastic tool, and I do recommend you check it out if you're at all interested in this part of the game that's otherwise lost to time. Thus far, I've made arguments that the game is neither something to approach with a singular mindset, nor something to treat as a significant time commitment. I've emphasized how this is different from the previous games in the series, but now let's talk about the core element that they all have in common. Of the 3 pillars I've outlined in every video, we've seen how the music has evolved from game to game in the series, and how the polish has usually been solid as one could ever hope for, but lapsed a little for Rayman 3. The art, however, has been the golden child that was consistently held to the highest standard across every game. It should be plain to see that Legends doesn't let the side down either. It's gorgeous. But the thing is, Legends lifts a large part of its style from Origins, merely updated with the new technology. While the quality of the visuals are undeniably impressive, does Rayman Legends deserve as much credit as the other games given that half the work was already done? Well, yes, of course it does. There's still the other half of the work to do after all. Beyond that though, I think there are 2 layers to this worth talking about. Visuals that add to what we know, and those which adapt it. I shall now cover them both, and a bunch of other arbitrary topics while we're at it. Let's start with Type 1 visuals, those which add to what we already expect. By this, I mean new artistic assets and stylizations which reinforce the feelings and ideas evoked by the base style, aka Origins art style. By far the most exciting way this is done is via the engine's new capabilities. The new lighting system adds to the epic factor. The addition of light rays and shadows is well suited to give the impression of colossal objects hanging over you, such as trees or towers. It's also good for exaggerating the effect of creepy dungeons or glowing hot lava. Simple, predictable things really, but still a huge asset to the game. We also have the new support for 3D models, used for certain enemies you encounter in the quest. It's usually reserved for bosses or at least strong foes that are specific to the area you're in. Most opponents still manage without the third dimension, but that works in the game's favor. The 3D is sparse enough that it remains special in the player's eyes and indicates to them when an enemy is worth taking a bit more seriously. The new flashy technology is marvelous, but one should not forget the benefit of getting the basics right, which of course they do. Several new enemies and environmental objects are added to the game with plenty of new character models to go with them, none of which feel out of place alongside the returning ones from Origins. All of it looks great. The easiest place to see this would be the player characters themselves. They still use the same 3 base models from the previous game, that's Rayman, Glowbox and Teensies, but the costumes have seen some expansion. In comparison to before, the number of Teensies skins is around the same, but the count for Rayman and Glowbox is vastly increased. I personally really like this variant of Rayman where he's wearing a helmet. I think the design is just nice, really. However, it might also be enhanced because the character's description implies he never removes it because his head is stuck. And that's just wonderful. I was drawn into one of Rayman Legends' tricks, you see. These descriptions don't appear by grabbing the Bubble Dreamer's beard like in Origins, instead they pop up when you approach the character's portrait in the selection area. This is less diegetic than the old style, and it takes a little away from the immersion, but it's much more accessible since you don't need to dig into the game's secrets and Easter eggs to find it. The, beard system? The beard system is more rewarding from a discovery perspective, but it runs the risk of not being found at all, or of players not being bothered to put the effort in. Legends wants to make this easier for you. That's another small thing to keep in mind. Now, enough faffing about. There's another new element that stands out sharply from the rest. The princesses, an all-new base model boasting a ton of variants to choose from. This gives us a new personality and animation set to mess around with, and of course, finally, a good number of women to play with, addressing the representation issue. But we'll get to that. Let's go over something else first. It's wonderful to be able to explore so many more personalities, but there's some baggage that comes with it. Hitboxes. Essentially, the problem is that all the characters have different shapes and therefore require different collision mappings, but simultaneously, the game is trying to make them all play the same way, which to be complete needs them to interact with threats the same way too. There's an obvious contradiction here. These two requirements cannot be fully reconciled. There must be a compromise, and I personally don't think there's a way to find one without hurting the game. The characters as is have subtle differences between their actions and hurt boxes, subtle enough that you won't normally notice them, but not subtle enough that it doesn't matter at all. For a more comprehensive view of how they differ, I draw your attention to the sourced video by YouTuber Kane. It covers all these things in much better detail than I ever could. Worth a watch for sure. Regardless, if the variations are nearly invisible, is it really that important? Perhaps not too much, but you may find that it's more of a problem than it appears at first glance. Consider, if you find yourself playing one character for a while, you may learn a certain set of actions that reliably achieve the results you want for a challenge. Switching to a new character at that point can lead to you repeating those very well practiced button presses only to see that they now fail. It is rare, but that very rarity is why it's so frustrating when it does come up. Quite early on, you establish a contract with the game concerning its controls, but the near imperceivable differences between the characters hide the fact that said contract doesn't apply to all of them. Therefore, you could well be left confused about what just happened, thinking that you've done something wrong when in reality it's the game that has tricked you. The developers could have tried to fix this by simply scrubbing out the differences, make every character play exactly the same way, but this doesn't work with the different shapes and animations between them. A hitbox that matches Glowbox will be far too big for a Teensie, and the opposite is also true. This could be rectified if they were all the same size and their animations were made to line up more precisely, but this would cut into the game's creativity and artistic vision, which is also a blow to its quality. The better solution, I think, is leaning into the uniqueness, exaggerating what differs the characters to the point of it being obvious. Now, we can't make it so extreme that the levels must be redesigned to accommodate every character. It's not reasonable to ask that of the developers given their deadlines. Instead, I would have a prototype character which all the levels are designed for, then all the actual PCs can be essentially the same but better in a specific way without being worse in any. The small differences that exist can remain, as they're more forgivable if we understood from the offset that they're not supposed to be identical. Some characters might end up being easier than others, but under this system we should never find ourselves in a situation that was clearly meant for someone stronger than who we're playing. My thoughts specifically for each character are as follows. Rayman should have a longer range, reflective of his disjointed limbs. Glowbox's extra blubber should make him tougher, so he can have 2 extra hits instead of just 1. The Teensies' lower mass allow them to change direction with little to no resistance from the game's momentum system, and the princesses should jump higher, courtesy of their long legs. These should be clear advantages. Rayman's range, for example, should be twice that of the others, not just a little further, so the intention is not prone to confusion. I think it would make the game a lot more exciting and bring the characters' strong visual identities into the mechanics as well. But, there's something you need to understand. I'm just some twat on YouTube. This game is great. Why should you trust me to know better? I stand by my thoughts, but it's not a one-sided situation. The developers might not have done what they did due to a lack of imagination or perhaps time constraints. There are valid creative reasons to make the choices that they did. For one, it's easier to create a tightly designed level when you know precisely what control set you are designing it for, but there's also an argument that favors player expression over player character expression. These characters are not just mechanical vessels for the player, their visual design gives them something else. They got personality and attitude. If you like the boisterous energy Rayman gives off but mechanically would prefer the extra hit point on Glowbox, then the game would be demanding that you choose what matters more to you, denying you your ideal experience. By ensuring that everyone is the same in how they control, or at least near enough to, it makes the choice simple. Go with the character you like the look of the best. Easy and done. It keeps the experience comfortable and welcoming without the need for you to examine your preference hierarchy, again making for a game that adapts to you, not the other way around. After all, the fact that the moments where this has a considerable effect are so uncommon means that if you just do the thing where you log on for a few minutes a day, you might never notice a difference at all. Perhaps my investment in this topic is a byproduct of how much I played the game for the video you're watching. I would still prefer for the characters to play their own way myself, but maybe you don't. We got what we got in the end, and regardless of your position on this topic, I think we can all still agree that it's an absolute delight of a game. So, oh well, I suppose. Right, hope you like that tangent. It's time for Visuals Part 2. No longer shall we discuss the art that reinforces what we've seen in past games, especially the last one, but the art that aims to take what we already know and from there guide you somewhere new entirely. I can show you what I mean by talking about the first world, Teensies in Trouble. The general color palette and layout of this world must seem rather familiar to those who know the series. As you see, it's another green forest. Every game has had a world like this near the start, usually right at the start. Rayman Legends uses that familiarity to settle you in without any major surprises, but before the first level is up, you will find yourself outside a castle, which soon, through the magic of doors, turns into inside a castle. And now it looks like this. Spooky, gloomy dungeon is quite the contrast to the jungle we took our first steps in, but it's without a hiccup that the game achieves this. It's all so smooth and natural. The two aesthetics are now tied together in your mind forevermore. The first world is not a woodland, and it's not a dungeon. It's both. The rest of the world's levels can and do make use of either environment, but thanks to this grounding, they just go together without seeming odd in the slightest. And then there's this random desert level, but let's just forget about that. The new take on the jungle contrasts nicely to all the previous games, but if we, once again, just limit ourselves to Origins, then we can see a pattern emerging. All the worlds of this game are in some way a twist on the worlds from that one. The weakest among them is probably the swamp, Toad Story. When compared to its counterpart, the Desert of the Didgeridoos, we still have some large musical instruments, but not nearly enough to feel like a significant feature of the landscape. That's aside from the obvious distinction between a bog and a desert. Both are hostile environments that people don't typically live in, I suppose, but for very different reasons. In the end, it doesn't feel like a new vision for an old world, it just feels like something separate altogether, and to be honest, I don't find it all that creative or interesting in its own right either. Luckily, the remaining worlds are closer to Teensies in Trouble than Toad Story. The new food-based world keeps the gimmick in clear view as you play, but adds a mariachi theme to the mix as well. We also have the hilltop mechanical hybrid world, which is like the last two of Origins, now held together by a classical Greek stylization of all things. This is a valid observation for the controls as well, as each world is built around the same power that characterized its equivalent from Origins. But this time, the powers are all unlocked from the very start, and they are put into completely different types of situations, permitted by the broader philosophy of the game covered earlier. We can say that this connected feeling between the two games is not just for your eyes, but also for your fingers. And while we're speaking about the differences between the worlds in both visual and mechanical style, that seems like as good a place as any to bring up boss fights again. I think they've seen a great improvement, and what stands out to me is that I don't mean that from a gameplay perspective. I think the design still leaves a lot to be desired between boring timings, lack of cohesion, and artificial damage windows, issues that I've covered more than once in this series. However, even when considering the problems, I still think positively of the bosses overall. The style and presentation really helps to drown out the shortcomings. Comparing to Origins, this could be down to the simple fact that their presentation is far more versatile. Ironic considering Legends rehashes cutscenes and story beats in every other way. So, I'm going to gush about my favorite one now. This giant wrestler bloke. Already, by looking at this footage, I think we see very well the energy of the fight. The crowd screaming in the background, the presenter with the round cards, the boastful laughter of your opponent. It's all just so badass while still being amusingly silly. This is a perfect example of what I was on about. His attacks are slow and dull, the fight is not comprehensive in the slightest, and the way he allows you to counterattack feels super forced. All of that can go to hell. It stands out as a highlight in my memory because the context is just that good. Beating this fight still makes me feel amazing, even if it's not technically the most enjoyable thing to play. The downside is that the more I replay the level, the more I get used to the style, and the more the weaker gameplay nags at me. That's fine though, I spend far more time remembering the fight than I do actually playing it, so I'll call that a win in the end. Honestly, boss fights are still probably the worst thing about the game, but the fact that I still conjure good thoughts for them overall just shows how jammed full of quality Rayman Legends truly is. Now, concerning the player characters again, how do they embrace Type 2 visuals to change something about our attitudes towards the last game? Well, admittedly, this is broader than visuals alone, but all the same, for this topic, we're going to talk about the princess's representation and sexualization in some detail. Yay! I had a lot to say about the representation of women in Origins, as I'm sure some of you remember. My overall judgment was that it was pretty poor. While I think that's worth saying on its own, part of the reason I brought the topic up last video was to make my opinions clear for the sake of comparing them to this game. For in Legends, I think the discussion is far more nuanced. Let's begin from the bottom. The princess's design still comes across as prioritizing the male gaze. All of them have huge titties, wide hips, and most sport outfits that display much more skin than seems necessary, which doesn't seem like a very promising starting point to say the least. You could argue that the way they're unlocked also plays into the damsel in distress trope, though in my opinion that's a weak case. A better one would involve the magician's personal prisoners, but I'm willing to let that slide since it's not the dominant portrayal of women anymore. Looking at it from a kinder angle, we can say that the nature of the characters' variations alone does a lot to alleviate the general lack of diversity women are given. The princesses come in pairs of sisters that each have their own designs and culture it implies. We have the barbarians, the spies, the highland warriors, the Greek nobles, and the party animals. However, this strength only goes so far. By the sheer fact that they use the same base model, the differences are relatively small compared to the similarities. This is apparent in things like the general proportions, facial expressions, and animations. Like all the other player characters, they are essentially different costumes for the same personality. Fortunately, it's a good personality. You may have noticed watching my footage that I'm using the princesses a lot, more than any of the others for certain. I favoured the Teensies over Rayman and Glowbox last game, but that was because I wasn't fully on board with this particular design for our main character or his best friend. I'm still not a huge fan to this day, for that matter. It wasn't because I thought the Teensies were really hitting the sweet spot, but the princesses are another story. I actively like them. I like that when they run forward, they eagerly lean into it with a huge, determined smile on their face. I like the way that when you enter a level, they swing their weapon in a loop and plant it in the ground, striking a confident pose while they're at it. I like the little they make when they jump around or finish a level. I like them because they are chewing up this role like it's the last thing they'll ever do. The other characters are either kind of derpy or feel very monk-like, but the princesses are here for the fun and excitement of charging headfirst into an adventure. Just like the player. They aren't just vessels for you to have fun. They're here to have fun themselves, and I love it. But that's where we must come back to their physical design. One could argue that their sexuality works with their confidence and passion, and therefore adds to their definition, but I don't think that's how it reads, since there's little sense that they are aware of said sexuality. The effect, I think, is more the opposite, where sex appeal acts to distract from character, rather than to enforce it. Now, I'm not the first one to have issues with them. This can be seen on the sourced Reddit threads by Seer553 and Trixie Hobbits. One thing that came up in these threads is a dislike for them as human characters, claiming that because Rayman's universe is otherwise populated by fantasy creatures, humans themselves don't belong. In its bluntest form, I don't agree with this point. Some of the past game's enemies have already been human for one thing, but even if they hadn't, I just don't think the addition of our species clashes with the existing stuff much, so long as it's appropriately stylized. However, I do think humans being out of place becomes a stronger argument when you compare what is a human and what is not in this universe. There is a trope called sexy dimorphism, where fantasy species will often have males with some sort of animalistic or even monstrous form, but females that tend to be built more like humans, and traditionally attractive humans at that. Rayman Legends is, intentionally or not, using the species of its characters to pull on the same idea. Technically, the men have weirder and more creative forms because they are not human, and the women, other than the Tinsy Queen, are, so of course they look more like us. But the result is still men that are physically unbound by anything, and women who have to be sexy. I think this touches on why humans might feel wrong in the world as presented. I don't think it's because they can't be there at all, but I get the feeling that it was primarily done out of horniness more than anything else, and if I'm right, then that comes across as just a bit shallow. Even so, I don't have a beef with fan service so long as it doesn't come at the cost of something more substantial. The problem is not that women are depicted sexually, albeit I wouldn't have put this in as child-friendly a game myself. It's that appealing to men is done without considering if it matches the character, and without showing much of other women who choose not to present like this. I think if some of the other character bases had a few more female choices, then this would have done a lot to address the issue. There's the obvious case for Ooglet, an existing Rayman character that could be created easily by dyeing Glowbox pink. The Tinsy Queen also gives us an easy base to make other women of her species from. Considering this, I think having some female Glowbox and Tinsy variants would have been perfectly reasonable within the constraints of development. While we're at it, why not have some princes as well, or make me very happy with a princex or two? You need to get rid of the boobs, but you could keep the hips, I think. Princes with chunky thighs sounds great, honestly. Granted, in this specific case, the changes might be a little tougher to make than I'm assuming, so let's leave my hypothetical developers alone for now. To present another perspective, a commenter called Baracon pointed out in my Origins video that the princesses being human sacrifice the opportunity to make them a better expression of the lands they rule over. The Fiesta world, for instance, is full of skeletons, so why not make the Fiesta princesses skeletons as well? How cool would that be? Again, you must be realistic with the developer's time constraints, but the skeletal princesses would still be possible using the same animations and, well, bones as the current ones use. So I think this is a great idea. Thanks for that, Baracon. Love it. I would like to think that for several of the employees, the somewhat degrading female presentation in these games was done out of ignorance, not malice, because of a blind spot rather than any conscious decision. I think for several of them, this would indeed be the case. But I can't forget that Ubisoft had many major sexual misconduct testimonies brought to the public eye in 2020. This has gone far enough now that some of those accused have been arrested, including the game's creative officer, Serge Ascouet. There's been plenty of reports that indicate that this wasn't just a few bad eggs. There was a systemic culture of enabling this sort of bullshit within the company, so I can't put aside that there's a genuine chance of blatant sexism being the reason behind the artistic choices. It's unfortunate, and I'm not saying that this is definitely the case, but it might be, and sometimes we may need to accept that reality can be ugly. So now, I guess I pass the floor to you. Are the princesses awesome, confident badasses? Are they shameless attempts to pander to horny teenagers? Are they fine as human, or would they be better as strange creatures instead? Are they cool in concept but fall short of their potential? Are they a result of Ubisoft's culture? Are they all of the above? Are they something else altogether? Well, discuss. Respectfully, please. It's a little abrupt, but as we get near the end of the video, I want to return to world design by following a specific case. 20,000 Lums Under the Sea, which is in my opinion the best world in UbiArt Rayman. It begins by greeting you with an ocean that's easily relatable to the Sea of Serendipity from Origins. Just like the other worlds, it first grounds you in the familiar, but as you dive deeper, you find yourself in a spy thriller setting where you get to play the highly skilled agent infiltrating a secret underwater base. So, as you can tell, the world's challenge is about stealth, and it's quite clever in how it approaches this. Roaming the facility and the ocean surrounding it are robots that project a green light representing their vision, making it clear where you'll be detected and where you'll be safe. If you enter the light, it will turn red over about a second, and if you don't escape it in that time, it shoots you with a laser for unavoidable damage. The system is both easy to understand when you first encounter it and lenient enough that you don't feel overly punished by it, but still strict enough that you get into the sneaky mindset. The enemies here enhance this feeling too. They often have ranged attacks and position themselves in tight corridors where it's hard to dodge their projectiles. Attacking them head-on is possible, but there's often a better way if you take the time to explore your surroundings. Mix in some real spot-on balancing between the running and swimming sections and the marvelous creative variety of obstacles you encounter, and you complete the recipe for a fantastic ride. A fantastic mechanical ride anyway, but how does the narrative hold up? Like all of Legends, it's not the best story ever, but the progression of the world does much more than the others to build up its own little tale without relying on cutscenes. You start with nerve-wracking espionage, but eventually you hit a high-intensity set-piece where your cover is blown and you're forced to fight your way out of a chaotic situation. Following that, you discover the base's purpose. They're building a secret weapon, and they must be stopped before they can use it. The final epic action scene comes as we attempt to destroy this creation while the world is still untouched by its evil. While a bit non-specific, the beats of this world follow beautifully with an infiltration action movie. It's easy to make that association, first because of the art choices, and second because of the way the events are organized. For a game with such a silly look, it's outright incredible how close they came to making you feel like James Bond or Ethan Hunt. It has been the case with this series historically that the games have had a good understanding of how gameplay progression itself can be used to tell a story. Now, I'm inclined to say that this isn't to the same standard as any of the original trilogy, but that's a high bar to be fair. It's still a nice wee story arc that adds so much spice to our experience. And as for that climactic final scene, let me paint you a picture. It starts with you walking across a platform that looks a little odd compared to everything else you've encountered so far, but seems stable enough. But almost as soon as you hop off the platform, it starts slithering away. The impression you're left with can be summed up as, oh fuck. It'll then snake its way through the background and foreground very fluidly, implying that it's stalking you, hunting you. The atmosphere is properly intense, by the game standard at least. It makes incredible use of the engine's new 3D capabilities, just as the stealth system made incredible use of the lighting system. You truly can't expect a better setup than this. We're led into another one of those remarkably stylized boss fights, which is once again oh so fulfilling despite shortcomings in the gameplay. Just to top things off, the musical level also serves as your escape back to the surface, completing the adventure. It's just about perfect, yet there is something interesting to say here. I've implied several times that Rayman Legends often works best when played in short stints rather than long sessions, generally better taken one level at a time, but this world seems antithetical to that idea. It is far superior when approached as a whole, not when broken up. However, these thoughts are only surface level. Rayman Legends has put so much effort into allowing you to play it in whatever way you want. Again, it doesn't have the raw difficulty of Rayman 1, the atmosphere of Rayman 2, the combat and area puzzles of Rayman 3, or the singular commitment to one idea of Rayman Origins, but what it does have is adaptability. It can be the game for you no matter what mood you're in. It isn't an experience in the same way, it's more of a comfort really. It's not trying to burn itself into your memory, it's not trying to immerse you for the long haul, it's not trying to play with your emotions. It just wants to be the small pleasure that you enjoy a little of every day. That's why it rewards daily logins, that's why it lacks deeper Easter eggs for you to find, that's why the story is so simple, divisible, and repetitive. That's why the musical levels are such a perfect fit for it, balanced excellently for maximum joy and minimum investment. Between these things, it's optimized for so many potential players. And 20,000 Lums Under the Sea is how it is optimized for me. It completes the picture by making sure it has at least one section for those who really are gonna be here for a while. Rayman Legends really did think of everything. That, I think, is why this is the most popular game in the series overall. Maybe it's not the one that you like the best, but I bet that you do at least like it. Pick any of the others and you can easily envision a person who would rank it very high, and another who would rank it very low. But Legends will sit well in the heart of anyone who enjoys a good platformer. If you have a bit of a taste for Rayman but aren't quite sure what you want beyond that, then there's no better place to be. So go on, go get some lums. If you liked the video, then, like it. And I'll see you next time.